Okay, I think when we talk about the topic of the American Revolution, we can talk about it in two different ways, and two different occurrences maybe is the better term. Obviously, there was the fighting that took place. It was a long conflict. It was 8 years long. And the aftermath of the revolution produced in the United States a feeling by many, those we call the nationalists, that the government that was created during the revolution just wasn't strong enough to deal with the challenges and the problems that the nation had in the 1780s. The first Constitution of the United States, written in the middle of the war, and it was called the Articles of Confederation. And it was purposely set up to be weak. Again, because the rationale of the people who wrote it and the people who lived in the 1770s and 80s was that why would we replace English tyranny, by which we are rebelling against, with an American version of tyranny? So the government it created was weak on purpose. The central government, the Congress, and there was one branch of government under the Articles of Confederation. It was very weak and could do only a few things. The government that existed during the war and during most of the 1780s had been called a firm league of friendship. In fact, that's a line from the Articles of Confederation. We are creating a firm league of friendship, which sounds great, but what happens if you've secured your independence in 1783 and yet the government can do very little? It cannot regulate interstate commerce, the trade between the different states. It does not have an executive branch to enforce the laws. It is unable to raise any revenue. It asks the money for the taxes for money from the different states. Doesn't require it. There's no independent judicial branch, a court system. So what we have is power in the 1780s exists with the states, not with the national government. A lot of people say that's the way we want it. Decentralized power. The government can become tyrannical if you don't give it a lot to do, is the mindset of the time period. But that group that I call the nationalists, the Alexander Hamilton, veteran of the American Revolution, James Madison, a Virginian, someone who came from it from a different perspective. He didn't serve in the war and see all that Congress couldn't do. Madison had served in Congress, and he understands that we might want to, and the term they used back then, is invest the national government with some more power. Otherwise, this new American experiment, this Republican form of government, doesn't refer to a political party, but it refers to what we now exist in our country as the government. This is a Republican form of government. We live in a republic. It's not a direct democracy, as people sometimes think. It is where we elect the people to make the decisions for us. Sometimes we have direct democracy at the state level. You vote on constitutional amendments wherever you might live. We do it in the state of Louisiana. But as far as the national government, it's set up a little bit differently. So that's the great debate in the 1780s. Do you leave things the way they are, understanding that there are growing pains and we're not always going to be the world's ugly duckling, we're not taken seriously? Again, we are treated as second-class nation by the French, by the Spanish, by the Dutch, by the English, even by the Barbary pirates who are intercepting American ships who go to the Mediterranean to try to trade. We no longer fly under the protection of the British flag because we are the independent United States. So we're poor economically, we are weak militarily, and a joke diplomatically. That leads many people to think we should give more power to the central government. It would solve some of the problems. Others are very hesitant because there are two revolutions that happened. The one in 1776 that said that governments are created by the consent of the governed so that we all don't go around killing each other. For our own protection, we give away our rights to the government to protect them. That was 1776. 11 years later, people are thinking, my gosh, we've unleashed the forces of democracy, when democracy is, I concluded last time, a four-letter word. It means ruled by the mob. The mob doesn't govern very effectively or very wisely. So maybe 11 short years after the American Revolution started with the Declaration, we might have to rethink some of the things we let loose as a result of the spirit of the 1770s and the spirit of the revolution. And nowhere do you see that more take place and more talked about than the topic we finished with last time. That's Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, 1786, 1787. Again, the people were getting control of the government. They were riding against the folks within the state. It was those in the debtor class, people who owed money, to those in the creditor class. And everyone from George Washington, who had retired and thought he was done with ever being in the arena anymore, out of public life, is getting letters from people saying, look, this is going to happen in other states if we don't do something. So they're trying to get the tall guy, as we call him, back involved in some way, to maybe put the brakes on the democratic forces that had been unleashed as a result of the American Revolution at the state level. Meanwhile, the nationalists are building the case that Congress can't do anything. They have no will to enforce any of the laws because there really isn't a branch of government to do it. So this leads us to, at the end of the last discussion, the calling of a meeting that was going to take place in Annapolis, Maryland. No one attended. The Annapolis Convention of 1786. But those that did attend said, look, we don't have a lot of interest right now. I think the lack of attendance represents the attitude in the nation. I mean, they got to Annapolis and the people who ran the state government in Maryland, Annapolis, Maryland, padlocked the state house so those delegates couldn't use it. So you're not getting an overwhelming support for giving this national government more power. I want to make that clear. The nationalists are a vocal minority. They had been members of the military. Many of them were veterans who saw, hey, you couldn't feed, clothe, or house the army. We almost starved to death. Mutinies multiple ways by the officers and enlisted men by the end of the war. Some of them had served in Congress, and they saw that it's a glorified debating society. Can't get anything done. But the nationalists are that, a vocal minority. They are led by very articulate and well-known individuals. We have Hamilton, we have Madison, and others. But there are just as many people who say, no, we start giving the government national power, and you centralize and put the potential for tyranny in one place. So before this group leaves the Annapolis Convention, they say, we're going to call a meeting. It will take place in 1787. We'll connect it to the place where Congress debated independence, Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Convention of 1787. We have now a full year lead-in to the meeting so that we'll have good attendance. Madison works on Washington. You just were chosen by your state of Virginia to go to Philadelphia. Washington says, nope, can't go. Not healthy, don't want to do it. This seems to me, if this meeting is another flop like Annapolis, it's going to make me look bad. Washington, very conscious of his reputation. But in between the calling of the meeting, Annapolis meets, not good attendance, not well received, and Philadelphia, you have Shays' Rebellion. So it's a tailor-made crisis. If you are a nationalist who is trying to get people in the State House, Independence Hall, in Philadelphia for the Philadelphia Convention, Shays' Rebellion is a perfect way to dramatize the plight of the nation. There will be copycat rebellions, they say, in New England and other parts of the American states if Shays' Rebellion goes unchecked. That's an important argument to make, and they have a good point. So when we get to Philadelphia, the meeting starts in May of 1787. These gentlemen, I should say, who are there are 55 of them who start out. And we know a lot about these folks because, well, they created the government on which we live under. So historians have done a lot of studies of who attended, what their backgrounds are, and what they wanted to do when they got to the meeting. That's why I put some of the statistics there in the notes. They're young, but this is a young nation. They're 41 years old is their average age. Again, that's an average. Not everyone who started going to the meeting actually finished. Some left for various reasons. They saw this meeting was going to create, and they said, nope, not going to be a part of it, left. Others thought the government wasn't strong enough. Hamilton was one of those folks. And so they all have different interests there at the meeting, but they are going there to do one thing. They were chosen by their respective state. We're not talking colonies anymore. We're talking states. So New Jersey sends a group, as does New Hampshire, as does Virginia. And Washington reluctantly decides to go. To no one's surprise, he is chosen the head of the meeting, the president of the proceedings. And when they get there, they're told by not only the Congress, remember, the Congress still exists, even though this one's eventually going to replace it, and the states. They're told, fix the Articles of Confederation. That's what you're there to do. Fix the Articles. Those are your instructions, Philadelphia delegates. And they say, okay, yeah, we'll fix the Constitution as it currently exists. Later, it will be called, this meeting of 55, a meeting of the demigods, meaning these are, in some ways, they are the political and intellectual elite within the United States in 1787. Now, we know a little bit about them, and I chose a couple of things to point out to you because I think it's important to connect their earlier experience in life to their attendance at the meeting. 3/4 of them had served in the Congress in the 1770s or 80s. 3/4. That means that 75% of them know the weaknesses of the Congress firsthand because they had served in Congress. About half of them have military experience. That's good because many who served in the Continental Army or in the militia realized that Congress had been completely unable to provide for the soldiers. And 1/2 of them are slave owners. They are going to shape this document. There are two divides at the Constitutional Convention, two major divides that could have sent everybody home. One is over representation in the states, small states versus big states. The other is slavery. Madison says it later because he gets there first, because he brought with him a rough draft of government to the meeting. He had already something in mind based on his experience serving in Congress. Absent from the proceedings are gentlemen that we commonly associate with the American Rebellion. And again, it's kind of like people who go to the archives, National Archives, and see Washington's name isn't on the Declaration of Independence. What happened? Well, he was in New York trying to, again, put together the defenses of those islands. Oftentimes, people connect folks like John Adams, who isn't at the Constitutional Convention. He's actually serving as an American minister to Great Britain. That's kind of awkward. You have to introduce yourself as the envoy of the former colonies who were just independent. Thomas Jefferson was serving as a minister, or ambassador, we would call it now, to France. Patrick Henry, the old give me liberty or give me death, as he thumped his chest in reaction to the Intolerable Acts. Patrick Henry said later on, I smelled a rat, and he didn't attend. So those who don't go, they're either posted overseas or they are staying home, and many of them, including Patrick Henry, will oppose this document when it's finished. They'll come out and campaign against it. The only person, by the way, who signed, just a little MacDonald trivia, the 3 founding documents, the Declaration, the Treaty of Paris, which ends the American Revolution, and the Constitution, is Ben Franklin. He's the designation, the only person who was just in the right place at the right time for those 3 considered to be the founding documents, obviously all significant in their own way. Well, those that attend, and this is fortunate for the cause and the meeting, have, I think, a generalized agreement of what they need to do, and that is fix the Articles of Confederation. The current government has weaknesses. We've got to address them. But the controversy at the meeting, it lasts from May to September in a pretty warm Philadelphia summer. They can get pretty long summers up there, and they close the windows, there's no central air, and it would have been pretty uncomfortable for everybody, but they stuck to it. Why it takes that many months is that they've got to iron out all the details. All of that has to take place. So we need to invest the government with new powers. How we do that, well, that's why we're here. The delegates make 3 early decisions at what we now call the Constitutional Convention. Back then, it would have been known as the Philadelphia Convention. Sometimes it's still called that. The first decision is that, as I mentioned, they're going to have George Washington, the tall guy. He's going to be in the front of the room, and he's going to be the president of the proceedings, not of the president of the United States yet. They have to have an election. But everyone knew that with him there, it would add legitimacy to this convention. Some people literally waited and said, I'm not going to go if, well, Washington's going. Oh, okay. That must be all right. Remember, this is a guy that resigned his commission, walked away from leading the army, and retired. That really doesn't happen at the end of revolutions throughout history. So he looked to be a responsible enough individual that if his endorsement is there by showing up, what does he do? Engage in a lot of debate? No, because he's a soldier and a farmer, not really a trained college constitutional thinker. He'll leave that to other individuals. So that's the first decision they make. The second is they are going to meet in secret. So that's why they close the windows, make sure that when they are not in meetings, that words aren't spoken to the general public. They would adjourn throughout the afternoon and have their big meal of the day, probably 2 in the afternoon, supper. And they would go to different taverns and make sure that they didn't speak too much about what was going on. There were people placed around Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin at the time would have been about 80 years old. If you've ever been around your grandparents or great-grandparents, you know people of that age don't always have a filter when it comes to what they say. And so they had folks around Franklin making sure he didn't talk about what was taking place in the meeting. And he was there to contribute as well, obviously, Franklin, through his lifetime of experience. The third decision that they made is that they were going to scrap the Articles of Confederation. So I think those two decisions are related. You bet they're going to stay meeting in secret if they go there to basically start with a new document. Because when they went there, they were told, fix the articles. Now they're not going to do that. They're going to completely abandon them and start from scratch. Okay, James Madison. Most people there at the convention thinks he is a student clerk or some kind of intern because they always ask him to get him something to drink or something like that. He's 5'3", about 100 pounds wet, this guy. And he always thinks he's going to die young. He always is perpetually wearing gray or black. And everyone there is not even recognizing that he is actually a delegate from Virginia. And he presents early on a plan from his home state. It's called the Virginia Plan, to no one's surprise. It will create, in the Virginia Plan, a Congress and a government with 3 branches. It will have a Congress with 2 bicameral, a House and Senate. Both House and Senate will be chosen by a state's population. So Virginia, in the Virginia Plan, will have more representation than Rhode Island. In the old Congress, 1 state, 1 vote. Virginia, you can have 6 congressmen from Virginia and 1 from New Jersey. New Jersey gets 1 vote, Virginia gets 1 vote in the old Articles of Confederation. The states that had large populations hated that, as did Virginia. There are more of us living in Virginia than Rhode Island. We should have more say. So that is in the original plan. There would also be an independent judicial branch and an office of president, a chief executive. How all that was going to be worked out and determined, that's why this literally took 4 months of debate. The Virginia Plan gave certain spelled out, we call them enumerated powers. And if this sounds like something like a civics class, it's because it is something like a civics class. This document is radically different than the existing Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. Enumerated powers. Congress and Congress only, not the states. Congress can do the following things and spell them out. They're very, again, particular about that. And just to give you kind of a comparison, let's see if we can pull up a slide here. I want to show you old versus new, what the Constitution did as compared to the Articles of Confederation. Here we have it. Let me make sure. I don't know if this is sharing right now. There we go. Okay, come on. There it goes. Okay. What you see on the left, and I'll go through, not all of you can see it, or those of you watching, let me get this to get bigger. Here we go. This should work. Again, the very basic premise of the Constitution was that it was going to give more power to the Congress itself. Power that would be not left to the states, but actually given to the Congress and Congress itself. Okay, in the old system, I say here, 1 vote in Congress for each state, 2 votes in the Senate for each state, representation by population in the House. That was the agreement that was made. But in the original Madison, Virginia plan, both House and Senate would be chosen by state population. And you can imagine the small population states didn't exactly like that. Now, in the Articles of Confederation, you needed 9 states for all important measures. Nope, simple majority now. You know, the Congress under the Articles of Confederation never could get anything done. To pass tax laws, you needed unanimous consent, all 13 states. If 12 voted yes and Rhode Island voted no, nope, didn't happen. That happened a couple times during the war when they were trying to raise revenue to, I don't know, feed the army and pay it so that the revolution would be a success. The third one, laws administered loosely by committees of Congress. Nope, not anymore. There'd be a new, powerful office independent of the president. One of the things that a lot of folks in the larger states and smaller states hated was that there was no congressional power over commerce. That's the regulation of trade. That was going to be done under the new Constitution, Article 1, which is devoted to Congress. There's no power to levy taxes under the Articles of Confederation. Under Article 1 of the new Constitution, extensive ways that you could levy taxes. Very limited federal courts. Federal courts would be capped by a Supreme Court. We're going to get into some of the details about that as well. Now, you couldn't coerce the states to do anything under the Articles of Confederation. If Maryland said, Congress gives instructions, this is your allotment of soldiers this year, and this is your tax allotment that you have to give to the national government, Maryland. Maryland said, no, can't do it, sorry. Taxes we raise in our own state are paying down our state debt. We're not going to be able to shift that much money to the federal government. And under the articles, the government would say, well, nothing. Under the new government, there is power to enforce the laws by coercion on individuals or to the states. Again, this is why some people were a little hesitant when they saw the details of the Constitution. They thought this is really giving open-ended, maybe unchecked power to the national government. So the small states didn't exactly like the original Madison plan. Again, once again, it was that the Congress would be determined, House and Senate, 2 houses, bicameral, by population in both cases. The small states said, we may as well not exist. And by small states, I don't mean geographically small, I mean population small. North Carolina is a small state. South Carolina is considered a large population state. Massachusetts is a large population state. So if you are, for example, Rhode Island or North Carolina, you don't like the system that says we're going to have less representation than New York or Virginia or Massachusetts. So that's why a group of delegates at the meeting from New Jersey came forward and put out a different plan. The New Jersey plan was essentially, it's there in the notes, calling for simply fixing the Articles of Confederation. So you've got on the table now 2 plans. You've got Madison's Virginia plan, which most people got on board with, and the New Jersey plan. So what they ended up doing is putting a compromise together and saying, let's take the best of both here. We will keep the 2 House Congress, the House of Representatives, the people's representatives, directed only by the people. That will be based on population. The Senate, the upper chamber, will have 2 senators for every state. North Carolina 2, Massachusetts 2, Virginia 2, Rhode Island 2. They will represent the interests of the state. The House will represent the interests of the people. More House members than Senate members. There are today 435 members of the United States House and 100 senators. Congress is 535 individuals. The first Congress obviously was going to be a lot smaller. The Senate would be chosen by the state legislatures, not by the people who vote. Originally, we've changed that. We changed that in an amendment about 100 years ago, in the beginning of the 1900s. So this is how it would be compromised. House by population. there will be more people in the House from Virginia than from Rhode Island. That's the way it is. Senate equal. Every state gets 2 senators. They would then talk about, again, these are weeks and months of debate, the part of the independent executive. They thought, who should we choose? Maybe Congress should just gather and we should just pick one of the congressmen to become president. And we're not even sure what kind of title there would be. But eventually they came up with the idea that no, because if you pick a member of the House or Senate to be president, then they're not really independent because they always have to connect themselves back to the legislative branch, the part in Article 1 in the Constitution. So we'll have an independent president. Article 2 of the Constitution talks about the office of president. It stands alone with a 4-year term without any limits. The president is now term limited, but we're talking about the original Constitution. Okay, a 4-year term that can happen as many terms as the people choose, although the people don't really directly choose the president. They set up an elaborate, confusing, and infinitely frustrating process that we call, of course, the Electoral College, which is not a pretty campus in Pennsylvania. It is an actual process by which every state has electors. There are more in California, by the way, Montana, that have probably more mooses than people. So that's why right now, well, maybe not right now is a good example because of what's going on with COVID, but in elections past, when we had like unfettered campaigning, presidential candidates would go to states where there were big electoral college prizes. If you win the electoral popular vote in a state, you get all of the electors, all of the electors. And so that's why presidential candidates visit places like Florida and North Carolina and Illinois, and not so much places like South Dakota, because they just don't have the electors. And multiple times in our history, the person with more popular votes, we always didn't measure the popular votes. We didn't measure them until about 1824. But the person with the most popular votes doesn't always win. It happened in 2016. It's happened in other elections. It could happen in this one too. You can lose by a lot of votes and still win the electoral. The majority of the Electoral College votes gets you presidency. That's how it works. Why did they set it up this way? Because the founders, the group at this meeting, didn't want to trust you directly, the people, with the voting of the president. So they set it up this way, the Electoral College. Can we change it? Yes. How would we do it? A constitutional amendment. That easy? No, it's not. It's not easy at all. It hasn't been done very much in our history. So those who are wondering at the meeting, okay, this president is going to be kind of the chief diplomat, commander of the armed forces. Well, that wasn't much of a job because we didn't have any armed forces in 1787. They were independent of the legislative or the Congress branch. So, you know, what is there any limits on what the president can do? And the answer is yes. Congress can, if there are high crimes and misdemeanors, impeach the president for whatever Congress wants to do, which we saw fairly recently. And even the impeachment process is divided between the House, which votes on the articles of impeachment, and the Senate, which has the trial. We've had presidents impeached, but impeachment is only part of the process. You then have to be removed from office, which has never happened. Andrew Johnson survived by one vote after the Civil War. Bill Clinton survived, Donald Trump survived, and Richard Nixon was told by his allies in the Senate, you ain't got the votes. And he resigned the presidency in 1974. So even that, you know, the vote and then the impeachment, it's a way to put limits on the president. It is not going to be confused with a king or kind of regent prince over there in Europe. Not at all. But early on, and we changed the Constitution, the president did not have any limits to the 4 years. That happened after World War II with President Roosevelt, who won election 4 times. Okay, there was wisdom to the idea also of an independent treasury, yeah, later on, but an independent judiciary, I should say, the Supreme Court. What we're just happen to be seeing two of these processes work out right now? Well, three: impeachment, an election, and the judiciary, with the nomination of a new Supreme Court justice possibly happening in the next couple of weeks. Now, it was understood there should be some kind of court system, maybe even a Supreme Court. The part of the Constitution that talks about the judicial branch is very short, Article 3. And it basically says, yeah, Congress later on will set up a court system. And everyone's like, yeah, okay. What about the details of it? Nothing. There's nothing that says you have to have 9 justices on the Supreme Court. All it says that they serve during good behavior. What does that mean? I don't know. It's kind of like, what are high crimes and misdemeanors for a president who might be impeached? And the answer one congressman gave one time was, anything we say it is. So there are parts of the Constitution that are, because we have a lot of lawyers present writing it, a little bit ambiguous and could be interpreted different ways. The one thing that there is not in the original Constitution, something we are very used to, is the court interpreting laws, either of Congress or the states. We call that judicial review now. This is why you're going to see a really beat down, drag out fight over the Supreme Court. I know a lot of people tell me things like elections don't matter. I don't care. It's just, both candidates are awful, or I shouldn't bother, or the two-party system is broken. And maybe all that could be true, but elections matter because presidents have to appoint members of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court interprets laws. Some people say they legislate from the court, but that's a whole nother issue we're not going to get into. But you as president can appoint someone who will serve on the court longer than your term as president, maybe even longer than your life. Years, decades on the court. There's no age limit. We're talking about, the possibility of increasing the number of people in the Supreme Court. It was talked about during the New Deal in the 1930s. 9 is a number because it's an uneven number, so that we can have decisions that go maybe 9-0, 6-3, 5-4. So it does matter. It does matter because the president, and if they are of a different party, they typically have a different philosophy towards what the judicial branch should do. Should they be more active? Should they be more conservative and try to follow the letter of the Constitution? These things matter. This new appointee is going to get questions about the Constitution itself and cases that the Supreme Court made earlier. Do you agree with this? Do you disagree? What do things like privacy, abortion, gay marriage? These are all issues that the court will have to weigh in and has weighed on in the past. And so there is this ability of the court to interpret laws, but it wasn't written out specifically in the Constitution. That was established later on by the Supreme Court. It's a way to say, look, you in Chicago or you in Louisiana have a law that contradicts the Constitution. It cannot exist, the principle of judicial review. Congress, you passed a law that violates part of the Constitution. That law cannot exist, and they would strike it down. Judicial review, not, let me repeat, in the original Constitution, but it's been established over the last couple of 100 years in cases that we will talk about in the future. Okay, Madison always said there are 2 issues that could send everybody home. The meeting could have completely gone off the rails if we hadn't made compromises in 2 issues. The large state versus the small state. We got that figured out with the way the Congress would be set up. Senate, 2 senators per state, House selected by the individual state's population. What about the other issue? The elephant in the room, slavery, representation about slavery. Because I will be very honest with you, no one was debating whether or not slavery was going to end at the Constitutional Convention. They were debating in what form can states where there are large numbers of slaves count them in the population. Of course, northern states said they can. Not because they said, oh, it's unfair, you can't count people that you don't represent that have no legal rights. The northern states were saying it's unfair to us. It's going to overinflate the southern states' population. But there was some debate. Things were said because in the 1770s and 80s, the New England states effectively abolished slavery in their state constitutions. Now, easier said than done if your population of slaves in a given state is 2 or 3%, as it was in most of New England. Further south, the middle states, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. Gradual 15% of the population enslaved. And so those states initiated a plan by which they would gradually emancipate slaves after they reached their 18th, 21st, 25th birthday. Each state did it differently. So there were slaves in New Jersey and New York into the 1830s and 40s. Because once you were born at a certain year, you became emancipated when you got to a certain year of your life. A slow, gradual emancipation. In the South, it's a deal breaker. Virginia all the way down to Georgia, they weren't going to have any plans for emancipation. So at the Constitutional Convention, we witnessed three slavery compromises. You should be familiar with these. One member of the Constitutional Convention said, if we keep slavery alive, we are putting ourselves in he called it a covenant, which is a agreement, a covenant with death. Well, he was right, except it took about 90 years for that to actually become a reality. The first agreement that was made over the institution of slavery was over the fact that Congress could not interfere with slavery for 20 years. Remember from the discussion last time, and this is why it gave some folks hope in the northern and New England states that maybe this would be the meaning to do something definitive about slavery. But folks, if they did, the southern delegates would have walked out and been like, look, you can have a nation of the North, we'll be in a nation of the South, and we'll pull the old 13 colonies apart. But some people thought, look, Congress has regulated the territories. In 1787, if you remember the discussion of the Northwest Territory, Congress banned slavery in the Northwest Territory in 1787, the same year as this Constitutional Convention was taking place. But that wasn't going to go really beyond that. Those who were from the Deep South, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, their representatives at Philadelphia said, we don't want Congress to at all interfere with the overseas slave trade. And that's the first provision. So what they were hoping to do said, look, and they wrote it out this way in the Constitution. Congress for 20 years until the year 1808 can do nothing to interfere with overseas, what we call the Atlantic or international slave trade. Congress can make no laws to stop that. This is a reaction to what's happening in the American South. You know, the economy was devastated as a result of the American Revolution, and Georgia and especially South Carolina planters wanted to get more slaves into their farms and plantations. This would be the way to do it. No interference with the slave trade, 20 years. Secondly, after much political wrangling, it was agreed that the states with slaves could count 3/5 of them, 3/5, 60%, towards the population. So Virginia could take the free white population plus 3/5 of the enslaved population. Those two numbers together would equal the state of Virginia's population. And they could do that in the states that had slaves. 3/5. Obviously, southern states wanted that number higher. That's 60%. If you had, for example, 100,000 slaves, 60,000 would be counted. It's the fabled 3/5 clause or 3/5 compromise in the Constitution. Northerners didn't like it because it overinflates. Again, it artificially increases the number of people, technically, even though slaves have no representation in governments in the South. But it was necessary. It was this way or else. And we, I think, honestly and rightly criticized those folks in Philadelphia saying, why didn't you just get rid of it? Well, Madison would later say, the greater good came from keeping the nation together, and maybe later in generations would be able to take a more definitive stand. Certainly, people thought that after 20 years, if you didn't bring more slaves in from Africa and the Caribbean to the nation, slavery would die, a natural death. They didn't realize that the population in the United States was increasing almost as fast as the white population through what we would call natural increase. They didn't know that then. We know that now. The third slavery compromise dealt with escaped slaves, runaway slaves, often called fugitives. There would be a fugitive slave law that the other states would have to aid in the return of an escaped slave. Slaves were property, they were an investment, they were valuable. And the Southern delegates insisted on this taking place, a fugitive slave law. We're going to return to that one really towards the end of the class because it comes up again in the 1850s. So you have a nation that is divided. Some have slaves, some have no slaves, and some have a lot of slaves in 1787. But this is the compromise Madison said would have to be made if you wanted this document a chance to pass, and if you wanted the document, the Constitution, to apply to all of the states. Because folks, writing it's only half the battle. That's the first part of it. The next part is they've got to send this out. Remember, they've met in secret. They've met from May until September, and now this thing is going to hit everyone around the country, and the reaction is going to be, wait a minute, I thought you all were going there. You know, people in the states and the existing Congress were going to say, whoa, 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 this is more than you were supposed to do, and now you've got to put it out there and see if the people's representatives would support it or not. What's interesting about all of this discussion when we talk about the slavery compromises, the slavery provisions, is that being a document made up by lawyers, you don't see the word slave or slavery in the actual Constitution. Persons held to bondage or labor, other persons. Those are the exact phrases that come from the Constitution regarding slavery. I guess they thought if they didn't put the word in, if it lasted for hundreds of years, that word wouldn't be there, but everyone knows what they're talking about for the most part. There were some murmurings at the end of this. 55 start out, I believe 39, just under 40 signed the finished document. You know, it starts off as the preamble, we the people. That is not the preamble in the Declaration. People think it is. We the people of the United States. As my professor at LSU used to say, we some of the people, it should be called, since this was not an overwhelmingly representative group of the American people. The folks that we like to call the pitchfork and torch crowd, the group that was protesting against the Townsend Acts, that were threatening to tar and feather customs agents, those who, again, picked up a rifle or a musket and went and enlisted in a Continental Army or militia unit, they weren't really represented in Philadelphia. And those who were in attendance, I think, realized that. So first struggle had to do with writing it. And we think, oh, okay, it's inevitable. This Constitution is stronger. It's therefore better. And it just went through. No. Before they left, they realized they're going to have to get the approval of the different states. That's the ratification process. The ratification process by which now it's submitted. Congress, the one that is about to go out of existence because there's going to be a new Congress under this Constitution. Congress has to approve it and then send it to the states. And that's when everyone who's participating in Philadelphia kind of holds their collective breath. We've gone way beyond what we were supposed to do. There's going to be hell to pay for it. And it is in no way assumed or a foregone conclusion that the document had to be written, would be written this way, and then would be approved. So half the battle, the other is the ratification process. And in that process, it's going to take, very clever. I'm going to introduce this for next time. Something that would, in the old Congress, need every single state to approve it. Nah, this group says we only need 9 of 13 states to approve it. Because we know we might not get all of them. But if you're one of the 9 approve and 4 don't, if you're one of the 4 that doesn't, you're going to have an unbelievable amount of pressure on you. You'll be treated like a foreign entity if you don't approve it. But I promise you this, it is an uphill battle. If we had we've studied this, the historians who really enjoy this kind of thing have studied the Constitution, and if we had put it to a direct vote of the eligible voters, adult males in 1787, it would have been overwhelmingly voted down. So with that in mind, how do you kind of go around the people and try to get those who are strongly in favor of it to be the ones to approve it. That's what they're going to have to do before they leave this meeting. Franklin was asked by someone in the street, Dr. Franklin, what did you all those months and weeks in there, what did you create in there? And he looks back and says, a republic, if you can keep it. But again, it's not assumed that ratification would become a reality. There are states, overwhelmingly, when they meet, they have a majority of those deciding the fate of the Constitution, up or down, who are overwhelmingly opposed to it. Virginia. If Virginia doesn't approve and ratify the tall guy who everyone thinks is going to be the first president, because they're writing the office kind of with him in mind, he can't be president if Virginia doesn't ratify. So that's a big if. There's a good amount of unknown to this meeting, and we'll pick up the story of ratification next time.